Okay, I think that we are live here on YouTube. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Emily Walker. I work at the U.S. Embassy Algiers. I work for the Public Affairs section, and part of my job there is overseeing the ACCA, which is sponsoring this talk. That stands for the American Cultural Center Algiers. The U.S. Embassy has several cultural centers around the country of Algeria. In addition to the ACCA, we have centers in Ouargla, Béchar, Constantine, and Oran. So if you are located next to any of those cities, please go check out those centers. After the coronavirus is over and we reopen, there's lots of cool things to do at the centers. You can check out books, DVDs, you can watch movies, you can practice your English with other Algerians, you can practice your English with other Americans, and you can listen to talks like the one that we're doing today. We're doing this talk virtually since we're not in our centers, and today's talk, we are featuring a special guest. She is a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy, so I'm going to introduce you to her. This is Suzanne Inzerillo. She's a Foreign Service Officer with the United States Department of State, and has served in a number of positions, both in Washington, D.C. and abroad. Her overseas tours have included Iraq, Afghanistan, Greece, and Australia. Before joining the State Department, she was an officer in the U.S. Army. Suzanne holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and master's degrees from the University of Illinois and from the Dwight D. Eisenhower School at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Suzanne is a leader at our embassy, and so I wanted her today to talk about leadership, and she's going to give you some tips she has for how to be a successful leader, whether you work in government or you work in business. So I'm going to kick this over to Suzanne. I'm watching the comments come in here on YouTube, so if you guys have a question for Suzanne on the topic of leadership, diplomacy, State Department, or anything else maybe you want to know about her life, please feel free to ask in the YouTube questions, and I will try to ask her your question. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Suzanne.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks to the ACCA team for putting this together. It's a great honor to be here. I've spoken in person at the ACCA, but this certainly is a whole new world for us all, I think. I'm really glad to be here with you today, though, so thanks for joining. So I've been with the government for over 20 years now. I began my career as an officer in the United States Army, as Emily mentioned, where leadership is something that is always drilled into you, how to be a leader, how to lead your soldiers, and how to carry yourself. But I left the Army and became a diplomat, and I found a lot of those lessons really have carried me through my career so far as a diplomat. And so I wanted to share with you just 5 or so tenets that I have that I think have served me well, and just explain a little bit about them. And then I'm, of course, happy to take your questions. Just put those right in the chat. And also, while I'm giving you my thoughts on leadership, I also welcome your thoughts on leadership in the chat. For instance, I wonder if you can tell me what you think the hardest part about being a leader is, and maybe we can discuss some of that in a little while. So the first thing that I learned as a very young person, probably at 19 years old, when I was just a cadet, that means I wasn't quite in the Army yet, but I was in training to become an Army officer. And that tenet was never ask your people to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. And what that means to me, even still, and now I supervise about 150 people, either directly or indirectly here at the embassy in Algiers. What that means to me is not that I have to do everybody's job, because I couldn't. You have to be able to delegate, but that you're willing to do the work that it takes to get the mission done. And that you also are not asking your employees, your subordinates, the people who work for you, the people who follow you, to do something that you're just not willing to do yourself. You have to be willing to stand up and know that what you're doing is right, and that what you're asking your staff is right. So the second tenet, and that I always try to keep in mind, is that one should try to be a servant leader. This is something that a very famous retired Army officer often talked about. And what that means is that you put your people first. I, again, have quite a large staff here, but I couldn't do anything without them. And it is my job to take care of them, to serve them. It is not to command them. It is not to direct them and tell them every single thing they need to do. It's to take care of them, and then they will do the things they need to do to accomplish our mission again. And I think that's really an incredible task that I'm charged with, and I take it very seriously. And so the way I call that is being a servant leader, somebody who serves and leads. The third tenet is to be, I say, a real person. That I am a person too. Leaders are people too. We have emotions, we have feelings, we have days when we're feeling really great and days when we're feeling not so great, especially a little bit right now during the coronavirus. And so I think it's important for my team to also know that I struggle, that I am not a robot. I have my own feelings and struggles, and also that I try and that I continue to try to push through those things. And that, in fact, we do that together as a team. And so, again, I call that being a real person. The fourth tenet that I have is to set expectations and also communicate them. If I've learned anything over the past 20 years dealing with people, it's that communications are some of the most important, if not the most important thing that we do. Talking to people, listening to people is an incredibly important but simple thing to do. So every time I enter a new job or have a new employee who reports to me, we sit down together one-on-one and I communicate what my expectations are for that person in their job, and also what I will give to them as their supervisor. And then I also give them a list of what my core values are as a leader. And those are customer service, integrity, and teamwork. Those are the things that I value most as a leader, and those are the things I value in the people who work for me. And then finally, and this one is probably the most challenging, I would offer that the thing about being a good leader and leading in general is that you also always learn. I think it's really important to learn both from your mistakes, but also from your successes. And I read books on leadership over the course of the years. I've read many. I've learned a lot about what leadership means and incorporated that into my own personal philosophy, and also learned the importance of diversity in leadership. And I think that's such a critical piece of what we do, learning what the skill sets are of the people who work for and with you, so that you can understand and challenge them to do better. So overall, those are kind of the 5 things that I look for and that I try to espouse, that I try to reflect as a leader. Never ask your people to do something you're not willing to do. Be a servant leader. Be a real person. Set expectations and communicate them. And finally, always be learning. So with that, maybe we can turn and see if there's some questions, or if anybody had any comments about what they think the hardest thing about being a leader is.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. We do have some comments and questions coming in here. You touched on this a little bit in your 4th tenet, but Archaic Rakoba on YouTube asks, how do you build your vision about your team? You mentioned when you do interviews, there's certain things you do and look for, but maybe you could expand on that a bit more about building your team, building a team of people whom you hire, who work for you.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great question. And again, one of the most difficult things about being a leader, because what you need to do first is identify what your mission is, as you said. So what is the goal of your organization? What is it you're trying to do? Of course, I work here at the embassy, but this is applicable no matter what. Even if you're in school and maybe you're leading a project, or you're in private business and you have a team. So the first question is to define the goal and what it is you're trying to accomplish. And then look for people who are willing and able to accomplish that with you. I think the way you get to that point and you find that people is, again, to communicate and to learn about your staff and what their skills are, what they bring, and then work together to help figure out how to accomplish that goal.
Thanks. Somewhat similar question. The same person, Rakoba, asks, how do you promote teamwork? And Abdurrahman asks how to build a good relationship with your team members. So how do you make sure people on your team work well together? And when a conflict comes up, maybe when some people on your staff aren't getting along, how do you handle that?
Also very good questions, and something that I think, despite all of the books that have been written about teamwork and leadership, still is very difficult. So I think I mentioned that I think communications is really the most important thing on any team. And this is very true between you as the leader and your teammates, but also between your teammates. The fact is, people are people. Not every single person is going to get along, and not every single person is going to like one another. But as the leader, it's your responsibility to address conflict head on. If somebody is on your team is doing something that is disruptive to the team or is making it more difficult for the team to accomplish what they need to, you as a leader have to take that on. And that's one of the hardest things we do as leaders and supervisors, is to address, let's say, conduct issues or issues with performance. But when you address those issues, it pays dividend. And that means that it's really important and it works well for the team in the long run. It is always more difficult in the short term to do that because it can create more tension. But once that person is either back on track, meaning they are getting back to doing their job and they're no longer disrupting the team, then in fact, in the long run, it really is better for the team.
But having those types of conversations are so uncomfortable since we don't really like to get in conflict. I know you have lots of experience with that, especially probably working as the human resources officer at the embassy in Athens, Greece. That's the person at the embassy who's in charge of all these kind of personnel issues, and when you're a human resources officer. So how do you actually prepare yourself or prepare to have that conversation with someone where you're bringing up a difficult issue?
Those are some of the most difficult conversations to have, for sure. There were a couple of ways that I approached it. One was, to the extent possible, to not become emotionally involved. I think oftentimes it's a very human feeling to think that you are a part of a situation, even when you're not, and maybe it has nothing to do with you. So if you have, for instance, let's say an employee who is, calling another employee names that are inappropriate, maybe that person has something going on at home and you are unaware of it. And that person actually doesn't even realize how hurtful their words are to their fellow employee. It's really important to communicate that clearly. There's a lot of different philosophies on this. Some people say, I just read this article in the Harvard Business Review, which always writes about these workplace issues, that said, there was this long-standing theory that was the sandwich theory of delivering bad news. So like a sandwich, you start with the top, which is something good. You insert the filling, which is the bad thing, and then you finish with something good again. So like you kind of sandwich that bad news in there. But this article said that that actually is not effective. It's more effective just to be very clear with people so that they understand. I have found a good technique for me has also been to follow up in writing. So if there's been a situation where I've had to speak with somebody about a particular topic, I also then send them an email afterward that puts in writing what it is I need to say. Oftentimes when we are being criticized or we hear news that is not welcome, we immediately get defensive and we stop listening. So I find that I try to have that conversation and then follow up in writing once the person has had a little bit of time to reflect. But I don't want to focus on the negative if I can. I think it is really difficult to have those conversations, and I think it's important to have them. But on the team building aspect, I think this goes back to just being a real person. When the people who work for and with you see you as a person, then they naturally, we grow a kinship, a friendship with each other, even though it's not a friendship, because as the boss, you can never truly be really great friends with people. Which is not to say that I don't have genuine affection for the people who work for and with me, but it's really important to just get to know them and have them get to know you.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, so the sandwich method, maybe not the most
Sandwich method,
but a catchy name. So some people are kind of asking you some hypothetical situations here.
Oh man, like an advice column.
Exactly, but they relate. Yeah, I don't know if these are issues they're having at their company and maybe want to see how you'd handle this. Abdurazak Mesadad asks, what would you do if some of the teammates are an obstacle or toxic to the project or goal, but you can't replace them?
Yeah, sometimes that happens. I mean, that is also a reality. But I go back, I'm sorry, because I'll probably say this at least 10 more times over the course of our time together, but that's where communications come out. I remember when I was a very young lieutenant, there was another lieutenant that I just did not like. We did not get along. We fundamentally saw the world differently. And at a certain point, it really was harmful to the unit. And our boss, we both worked for the same person, brought us into the room and said, look, you need to figure this out. And what we did was have a talk and try to at least explain where we were coming from. People don't have to be friends, again, who work for you, but they do have to be respectful and they do have to work. So if they're not doing those two things, that's when the supervisor has to step in. And if you feel like there's some teammates who aren't doing those work, you might have a conversation with the supervisor about it. Or if you are the supervisor, then you probably have to have a conversation, a hard conversation with that person.
Thank you for that. So at the beginning of the talk, you asked the viewers what they think is the most difficult part about being a leader. One response to that is from Linda Amira. She says the hardest thing is to have to make the final decision, and maybe that final decision is a big failure or leads to a big failure. So having that responsibility. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, if you do find that a hard part of being a leader, and maybe some tips you have on making those big decisions and taking responsibility for them.
Yeah, that's tough. You're right. I feel like that's all I do now is make decisions. I'm not sure I would have said that 10 years ago. My job was more actively involved in the work. Now my job is to make decisions and oversee the people doing the work. So I make a lot of decisions every day. And it is challenging. There's a couple of things to think about when you're making a decision. One is, do you have the information you need to make the decision? And two, when do you have to make the decision by? Is there a certain deadline? And what I would say is, if you can wait for the perfect information in order to make a decision, great. Sometimes you can't though. Sometimes you have to make a decision using your best judgment based on the information you have. And you know what? Sometimes that might be wrong. I will say, I've been wrong many times. That happens. And I feel like one of the things that is important is to learn from those times. I was working in Washington in an office, and I had two employees who did not get along at all. And so it was almost like the story I told about when I was a young lieutenant in the Army, I was now the supervisor of two people who didn't get along. And what happened was I actually spoke to them individually And upon reflection, I think I should have brought them in together and helped to facilitate the conversation between the two of them. Because basically I brought them in and was like, you need to get over it and figure out how to deal with each other. And I'm not sure that was the best approach. But because it didn't work out, now I won't make that mistake again. And so that's why I think it's important to always be learning, because these are really hard things.
You mentioned that you've made big decisions and been wrong. What do you do when you're wrong? Do you somehow publicly or among colleagues acknowledge that you were wrong, or do you just not say anything and hope no one will notice you were wrong?
I'm going to say it depends. And in the diplomatic world, we use that expression a lot. It depends, because there's just so many different options. If I've done something that was public, if I've made a decision that was public, and if I hurt somebody or it offended somebody, I think it's important to admit that publicly. In the case of these two people that I'm discussing, when I was saying I was wrong and how I handled it, I actually did bring them back together and apologize later to them. It doesn't take away the fact that they were acting unprofessionally, but I also, by my actions, admitted that I didn't have the right answer all of the time. And I think as a leader, you have to admit when you're wrong. I think humility, being humble, is one of the aspects of being a servant leader. And part of being humble and having humility is admitting when you're wrong. And I think if somebody who works for you is right and you're wrong, and you don't say to that person, you know what, you were right, I was wrong about that, it really lessens the respect that that person has for you. So I think admitting it is really one of the most important things. I'm not perfect at it, but I do try.
Thank you for that. A question from Arua TLH on YouTube. They want to know, how do you lead through change? We definitely have some weird, everybody does right now with coronavirus. Everyone at the embassy has been working from home. This has been a big time of change. But also you move to a new country every couple years, and that's probably a lot of change. So how do you maintain being a strong leader when things are changing?
You know, we're definitely in the kind of work in the diplomatic corps where we change all the time. As Emily said, we move jobs, move countries, move everything every couple of years. And so change is fundamental to what we do. So for me, change, how I handle change personally is a bit of self-care, which is, I know that there are certain things that are really important to me. And I think those are important no matter what the situation is. If I've moved, where I need to, for instance, just make sure that I have my basic needs met. I want to be able to communicate with my family and friends back home. I want to make sure that I feel safe and that I can eat. I'm a vegetarian, so I want to find the best local vegetarian food. Also, if you have any tips on that, please let me know. So those are the things I look for personally. But professionally, I think one of the biggest things is to not enter a new situation and try to change everything right away. Again, when we come into an embassy, we have staff who've been there for 5, 10, 20 years, and I'm brand new. Certainly there are things I know and there are experiences that I've had, but one of the most important things is to just stop and listen and hear from the people who are actually there and understand the local situation. But even with that, things have to change. Policies change, procedures change, laws change. And so our work naturally changes, even in the best of circumstances. And for me, I go back to communication. Communicating the why about changes to the people who are working for me is really, for me, how I try to handle change in the workplace.
Thank you. Similar to that, Mohammed asked, how do you adapt to different cultures and religions?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's part of our job, is to learn about that. And so here in Algeria, I've been here since last July, I guess. And so for the first half of the year, I really spent trying to learn more about the culture and about Algeria in general. Unfortunately, that has been waylaid a little bit due to the pandemic, so I haven't been able to travel here in Algeria as much as I would like. But I think I'm in the right line of work because I enjoy that. I love exploring new places, new cultures, new religions, and just really learning about that. I think of myself as a student of the world. There is always something to learn somewhere. So I'm just really lucky to be in a job where I get paid to go to new places and do that.
Thank you. Well, so you touched on how you deal or integrate into this other culture. A question just came in from Med Jolie, who says, Suzanne, how do you deal with people in different cultures and religions in your workplace? So maybe staff you have who are working together. And I just want to make sure that everyone heard something Suzanne said earlier, which I think maybe people don't really know about embassies, is that us Americans are going to different embassies around the world, and there are always local staff who are working with us at the embassy. So we're not just a bunch of Americans in our own bubble. In some ways we are, but we have always local staff. So at our embassy, we have lots and lots of Algerians who we work with, who are gracious enough to let us know the good places to eat, things about their culture, and answer our questions for us. So back to you, Suzanne. How do you deal with maybe a team who has different cultural and religious backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think communicating together and honoring that and finding where the common ground is, because at the end of the day, we are more alike than we are different. If I've learned anything in my time, that is the case. And so what Emily said is absolutely true. I have an Algerian assistant. I won't say her name because I think she'd be probably really embarrassed because she's one of the most humble people I know, but she's phenomenal at what she does. She is just a wonderful, wonderful colleague. I could not do my job without her. And I ask her advice always. If there's something maybe culturally or religious wise that I don't know or understand, I will find a way to try to just ask her politely. And she's incredibly patient and gracious to explain it to me. And I think that she does that because she knows when I'm asking, it comes from a place of just wanting to learn and be respectful. And so she's willing to share that. So absolutely, we rely on our local staff so much. We could not do this work without them.
Very, very true. A question from Skyline, who asks, what are the basic qualities you look for when you're choosing whether to hire someone? Do you have maybe like 3 or 4, this person must have these qualities?
I mean, I think I want them to be a good communicator. I think, again, I told you I'd keep saying it 10 times, but absolutely. They need to be able to communicate both verbally, but also in writing, because we do a lot of writing in our work as well. They need to have integrity. They need to display that they are, in fact, somebody who is trustworthy and who is willing to put themselves out there. And then finally, well, 2 more things maybe. I really look for people who like to work on a team. I have been really lucky, and I've had many individual accomplishments, things that I really felt like I was able to do. But I have to tell you, those don't mean nearly as much to me as the things that I've been able to accomplish as a team. I have been just really grateful to work on many, many teams, and I value that in my colleagues, people who want to work together. And I had another one, maybe not, maybe. So those are the things that I really am looking for: teamwork, integrity, and somebody who can communicate. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to add one other thing, which is I'm a big believer that not everybody comes into a job with exactly the skill set that they need to do that job. I mean, for instance, if I need an IT person, because the IT folks, work for me, they need to have the basic skills. They need to know how to do that. But there are a lot of specific embassy systems that they couldn't possibly know. So I'm always looking for people who are willing to learn more, because no matter what job you go into, there's always something to learn, and you have to be willing to learn and adapt to whatever that is. So I think that flexibility is really important.
Thank you. How do you tell when you're interviewing someone if they would be a good team player? You might just be interviewing them one-on-one. How do you know if they'll work well in a team?
That's a great point. You don't always know. And to be fair, some people interview really well, and then it turns out that they're just actually, they should have gone into drama because they're very good at pretending to be something that they're not. But I think one of the ways that you can get to that is to ask them situational questions and to ask for examples of when they've worked as a team. And it's not necessarily the exact answer that they give. There's no right answer to that question. But if they have to think long and hard about whether or not they did something as a team, it's probably been a while, and maybe they're not somebody who works so well on a team.
Good point. We have a couple of requests for your favorite books. So Larbi Tual asked what your favorite books are, and Youssef asked what your favorite books are about leadership.
Okay, so I was
a combo of those.
I was going to ask, are these books about leadership or books in general? So books in general, gosh, I've always been a pretty avid reader. You can see some of my favorites behind me. I've recently, in the past couple of years, gone to a Kindle, the electronic book, which I never thought I'd do, but I have to say it's been wonderful. There's a couple of books I tend to read nonfiction. I like history. There's a book that I read in college that I reread every few years, and it's called Home Before Morning. And it's about an army nurse in Vietnam and what she went through. And that book, I read it first when I had not yet fully joined the army, when I was studying at university, but I knew I was going into the army, and it really spoke to me. So that's one. Let's see. I've read 13 books so far since we've been on quarantine, so I feel pretty good about that. I think another book that I've really enjoyed more recently is Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. I think there's actually some leadership lessons in there because it does talk about unconscious bias, which is an incredibly important thing right now, always, but it's a topic that you're hearing a lot more about right now. And one of my other favorite leadership books is called Radical Candor. Somebody who used to work for me actually gave me this book and said that some of the stories kind of made him think of me. And I was really honored by that. It was incredibly touching. And so that one in particular really was good. And I think it fit with my philosophy towards leadership, which is those conversations sometimes are really difficult to have, but you have to have them. And this book, Radical Candor.
Suzanne, I think I just lost the sound. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
I think we just had maybe a 10-second delay in the sound. I last heard you speak about the book Radical Candor and how it reminded this person of you. I didn't get what you heard at what you said after that.
Sure. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Radical Candor talks about having these hard conversations with the people who work for you. And it was really gratified to read that because I felt like that is how I try to be and to have those difficult conversations. So I thought that was a good one. I also recommend reading biographies. I think biographies of people are always a really interesting way to approach leadership. Churchill, I read a book about Churchill over the pandemic, which was shocking, frankly, but also just really interesting. So those are a few of my favorites.
Well, actually, that was another question we got from Youssef. If he had any, if you had any leaders who you look to as examples, I don't know if you looked at Churchill as an example, but you read his biography. Are there any other historical leaders who you look to as a role model? And I'd also like to know about non-famous role models who you've had in your life, if you've had a mentor perhaps who's kind of guided you in your career.
Yeah. So I guess in the realm of sort of famous people, I had a job within the diplomatic corps for 2 years, where I actually worked with the staff of the Secretary of State. And at the time I did this, I worked part of my 2 years with Condoleezza Rice, and then the other part with Hillary Clinton. Two women, that was about all they had in common. You had an African American woman and a white woman. You had a northerner and a southerner. You had sort of, Condoleezza Rice grew up in Colorado, and Hillary Clinton actually grew up not too far from me, but had lived in the South. Very different personalities, one introvert, one extrovert, but both brilliant women. And for me, actually reflecting on watching both of them approach the same job was an incredible honor, frankly. And especially as a woman in the diplomatic corps, to be able to see firsthand how hard they worked, how good with people they were, and then what a wonderful experience that was. So I'm really grateful to have been able to do that. Non-famous people. In my second tour in the State Department, when I was in Australia, I worked with somebody whose name also happens to be Suzanne. It was the first time I'd ever worked with anybody else named Suzanne. And I, was a shock. She was my boss. But I have to say, I really grew to appreciate her as a supervisor. And one of the things I saw her do was to have those hard conversations with employees who were not performing. And I took that lesson with me. That's where I learned it, frankly. And, 15 plus years later, she's still a very dear friend of mine. I know her family well. I've spent holidays with them. I actually had the good fortune to serve with her again in Greece later in my career. But she really took the time to be an example and has continued to just give good advice. Sometimes I just call her and say, hey, what do I do? She's always pretty spot on in her advice. And it's not just because her name is also Suzanne.
You have more of a connection beyond just your shared name.
Yeah.
The question came in earlier from Arua, who asks, as a female leader, what's been the biggest challenge in your career? So I assume she's asking perhaps your thoughts on barriers faced by women in the military, in government jobs, in the State Department.
So it is an interesting question. And as I reflect, when I came into the US Army, there were still many specialties that women could not do. They could not be in the infantry or in combat situations. But I'm also proud to say that that's changed. The Army, the military in general, has opened up all positions to everyone. And so I think it goes to show that you can learn and adapt as an organization, because the military did that. As a woman coming into that situation, I have to say, I just always felt like my role was to do my job and to be the best leader that I could be. Again, did that mean that I failed sometimes? It definitely did. Did it mean that I was successful sometimes? It actually did too. And so for me, it's always been about just being who I am and being true to who I am. Sometimes those barriers are there, but I like to think bit by bit, we're taking them down a little bit.
And how have you experienced the same issue in your career as a Foreign Service officer with the State Department? Have you noticed any discrimination because you're a woman? Have you seen a change maybe in the State Department in the 20 years that you've been in the State Department, hiring more women, having more women in roles of leadership? Oh, and I think you just froze. We'll wait for Suzanne.
Yeah, I was going to say, sorry, I think I froze a little bit there.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yeah, did you hear my question?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's been less in the State Department, frankly. I just feel like I've kind of always put my head down. There are times when I'm in meetings where I have been the only woman in a meeting, for instance. The gender balance is not quite there yet in the State Department. But I have to say, being here in Algiers has been such a wonderful experience, because my more recent time in the State Department has been that. When I look around our senior leadership meetings, there's a number of senior women there, and I think that's really cool. We do have further to go, and we have further to go in diversity as well. We're well behind in diversity where we were in gender relations. Or where we are in gender relations. So we are not perfect, but again, organizations can and should adapt, and we need to in order to survive.
Thank you. So you started your career out in the Army as an officer. So you were kind of in a leadership role probably at quite an early age, and you've had leadership roles since then. What about for some of our viewers who, maybe are really young and they're not in any sort of leadership role right now? What sort of advice would you give to them to kind of how to be the best team player that could maybe advance their careers?
Yeah, I go back to a couple of things. One is to communicate and to make sure that you're always really clear, both with your teammates and your boss. To be willing to try new things. I will just say I've had a couple of experiences in my career where I thought I was going to do one thing and ended up doing something totally different, and took a bit of a leap of faith. And it's always really worked out for me. And so what I would say is, if opportunities come up where you have a chance to lead, even if it's a small group or, a small project, it's a really great opportunity to start those skills early in your career. So don't be afraid to take those risks. I wouldn't go to your boss and say every day, when are you going to give me a project? When are you going to give me a project? Because that's not going to be helpful. But be willing to work, be willing to volunteer when opportunities come up, and be willing to show that teamwork aspect. And I think it'll pay off in the long run.
Thank you. Well, we'll just take a few more questions here, I think. Sophia Mez just asked if you think an introverted person can be a leader.
Well, Sophia, the answer is yes, because Emily's laughing, because I am a 100% introvert. When I test on Myers-Briggs, I test all the way over on introvert. So just remember that being an introvert versus extrovert doesn't necessarily mean that you're shy. I think for a long time, until I actually read what the different definition of introvert versus extrovert was, I thought that's what it meant, that you were shy. I'm a little bit shy, but I've gotten better at it over the years. What being an introvert means is that you gain energy by being alone. And if you're an extrovert, that means you gain energy by being with other people. And the test is, when you go to a party, do you leave that party super excited and energized and ready to keep going? Or do you leave and say, I want to go to bed, I want to be alone, I want to not talk to somebody? And for me, the answer is very clearly the latter. And it doesn't mean I don't like people, and it doesn't mean that I don't like to go to parties. It just means that at the end of it, I need a little bit of time to recharge my batteries. And as a leader, that's one of the most difficult things. I mentioned very briefly self-care, and this idea that you have to take care of yourself first. And that's where the introvert in me comes out. Sometimes if I've had a really long week, that means that maybe on Friday, I just take like a good couple of hours and not talk to anybody and relax either with a good book or a TV show, so that I can recharge my batteries. So you can be an introvert and be a leader.
Thank you. I'm going to come back, and the final question is going to again be about being a leader, but a personal question. Some people are curious if, after all this life of traveling abroad and living in different embassies around the world, do you ultimately see yourself moving back to the US for a longer period of time?
I do. The US is my home. It has really been an honor for me to represent my country in all these other places over these years. But at the end of the day, my family and friends, some friends, I have friends elsewhere too, but my family most particularly are back in the United States. So that is where I know I will find myself when this career comes to a close.
One more question, then a final question about being a leader, because I'm sure people are curious how you found Algeria. You've been here for a year now?
Yeah.
About a year. What are your impressions of it? Did anything surprise you that, maybe you were expecting something different? What are your thoughts on Algeria?
Yeah, I really like Algeria. You can't beat the climate for sure. But actually, the thing I always say to my family and friends back home when they ask me about it is just how warm Algerians are. I have been astounded by how wonderful Algerians have been to me, a stranger. And whether that means at the supermarket when I try to speak my pidgin French because my Arabic is not very good, that they are kind and gracious and help me get what I need to. Everything like that. It's been a really warm and welcoming place. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question that just came in from a user who I believe is my mother. Otherwise, she has the same name as my mother. But Kathleen Walker asks, I noticed the American flag in the case behind you. Is it a burial flag of a veteran family member, or does it have some other significance?
Thanks, Kathleen, aka Emily's mom. You're right. It is a folded flag. It is not a burial flag. It actually flew over the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. And so when I served in Afghanistan, I served a year there and was really honored that the Marines gave me a flag before I departed. It's a really special thing to me, for sure. And thank you for asking about it.
So one final question, the final question to wrap this up. Thank you guys, everyone, for your questions. I want to ask you, Wani asked, is being a good leader a born gift or is it acquired?
Gosh. I think it's a little bit of both. I think some people are meant to lead and have those skills, just like some people are born with wonderful musical ability. I am not. Some people are born with beautiful language ability, not me. But I think I'm very lucky in that I do think that part of my personality is that. I also think that I have continued to work hard and study leadership and also learn from my mistakes. And just finally, I want to say that I have been so lucky over the course of my life that I've had opportunities to lead. And whether that was in high school or, even in college, in the Army, and now as a diplomat, I just feel like I've had these opportunities to learn and grow and have such a supportive family. My parents could not have been more supportive of this crazy life I've chosen. And so that is, I think all of those things have led me to be the person I am. So I would say there are some people who are born great leaders. There are some people who work at it. But I think the truly best leaders do both. And that I would say is true for any skill. Emily, I have one question before we cut off, which was, did anybody give us any good tips on vegetarian food?
None of those came in. Somebody did mention that they're a pescatarian, so maybe they have some tips also, but no.
Yeah. Well,
guys,
okay, maybe
still have time to add those in the comment. Suzanne and I are both vegetarians. If you have any good vegetarian restaurants or food options for us in Algiers, especially, we'd appreciate it. But so the chat will stay open for a while, even after we end this live stream, so everyone can still comment. Please do follow us on the YouTube page, and we're basically doing one talk like this a week, so you can feel free to let us know other topics that you'd hear or that you'd like to hear. Suzanne, thank you so much for your time. Those were excellent, excellent leadership tips. I found them very inspiring, and I hope our viewers did too. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for